I'm here today with Francis Menton, the Manhattan Contrarian, an excellent writer, a great mind, and a good friend. Uh, Francis, tell us what's been up with you.
Oh, well, I have a blog, the Manhattan Contrarian, which it is, I would say, relatively successful in the sense that it has built quite a bit of readership, and I devote quite a bit of time to it. It is not a revenue-making operation, so it's just a labor of love or a hobby. But I hope that your listeners will track it down, manhattancontrarian.com.
Yep.
But I would say that's about a 30 or 40% of my time job uh, compared to a full-time job. And the rest of my time goes to a lot of other things. I have some young grandchildren. I spent the afternoon yesterday with them and their mother, my daughter. And I try to spend as much time with them as I can. And I also have various other interests. I'm on the board of this Global Warming Policy Foundation, which we were just talking about. I sing in a choir here in Manhattan. We have a concert coming up on May 6th. I got to put an announcement of that on my blog so people can find out about it. Maybe we can maybe we can drum up some audience. We're singing the St. John Passion at a pretty famous church in Harlem, Mother AME Zion or something like that, in Harlem. If you haven't been there, it's not such a bad place to go. It's a good place to
go. So I was reading an editorial in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, and I could read it out to you, but just to cut to the chase, it's reminiscent of the nursery rhyme, little old lady who swallowed a fly. She had to eat a spider to catch the fly. She had to eat a mouse to catch the spider, and then she had to eat a cat to catch the rat, and the mouse to eat, so forth. It's one fix after another. And so in this case, they've been subsidizing wind and solar, and so because of the subsidies, those industries are now able to bring power at a lower price than some of the oil and gas. But oil and gas are essential because wind and solar are not always there. You got a cloudy day or a day with no wind, or the thing ices up one way or another. And so you have reliability versus subsidy. And so now Texas is going in and like little lady that's swallowing a spider, or maybe they're up to the mouse or the cat by now. So they're going to be subsidizing gas furnaces, which are not going to be used except in the emergencies that present themselves because the wind has pushed out the oil and so forth, and they're going to be used on an emergency basis, but that's not efficient because they're only going to be turned on now and then when the wind doesn't work or the solar is not there. So I don't want to spring that one on you, but maybe you could talk about this kind of regulatory, I don't know, little lady that ate the spider kind of thing, ate the fly. Where does this all unravel? How does it weave, and what have you been working on in that regard?
Well, I actually have written more than one post. I have on that blog that you were just showing. I have, I'd say, on the order of 2,000 posts that I've put up over the course of the last 10 years. And the subject you're just talking about is something I've addressed more than once, which is the market structure for the purchase of electricity. When you and I were kids, the way it was done was that a utility was an integrated power provider. They owned the power plants, they owned the high voltage transmission lines, they owned the low voltage transmission line that went into your house. They owned the transformers, they owned every aspect of the system, and the regulator accumulated up their costs, and they got their costs plus a government determined profit for providing you the electricity, and that was how the system worked. Somewhere along the line, this is a process that probably started 30 or 40 years ago, but it's pretty much complete now. Geniuses who think they can do better. And by the way, I don't think the regulated monopoly model for utilities was that great. But the genius who thought they could do better came up with a different model, which is that the utilities won't own the power plants anymore. Anybody can own a power plant, and then each power plant gets to bid in a marketplace to the utility to provide the cheaper power. And so that's basically what we have now. But they designed and set that up, and it was clearly set up in a way to favor the wind and solar producers. So they have day ahead markets and spot markets. They don't have month ahead markets, which is what they ought to have. They have day ahead markets and spot markets. And first of all, whoever bids less gets what's called priority of dispatch. So you get to put your power onto the grid. And if you don't get priority of dispatch, you don't get to put your power on the grid. Oh, and then they gave solar and wind inherent priority. If they're competitive, they go first. They always go first, and then they blank out the rest of the time. I've been complaining about this ever since I started writing. It obviously doesn't make sense. So what happens here is the solar and wind, when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining at noon on June 21, they can provide almost free power. How about at nighttime on December 21? They can't provide anything. So somebody else has got to do it. And this works if you have a spot market 1 minute ahead, or maybe and I don't know if it's a minute, but it's almost that. They have a day ahead and then a minute ahead markets for power. If you have that, the solar and wind, and you give priority to solar and wind, they'll always get priority when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, and the rest of the time you're on your own. This doesn't make any sense. Now, I tell you, the right system makes perfect sense. By all means, have a competitive market. The competitive market is, we need X gigawatts of firm power a month from now. Make a bid for that. You're a wind and solar producer? Make a bid. If the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, great for you. If it's not, you still have to provide the firm power. You got to provide it. It's up to you. By the way, this would put the wind and solar producers completely out of business because they can't do it. They would have to pay their own costs and also the costs of the backup, and the natural gas provider have to provide for their own plant. So my system would clearly put the wind and solar out of business, or another way of putting it is, it would reveal that they're not really cost competitive. They're only cost competitive in a stupidly, artificially created, quote unquote, market. It's not a real market because no market would ever create itself this way. It's been created by stupid regulators, and it's a mess. Now let's talk about Texas. Texas is in a mess for exactly the reasons that I said. Don't subsidize the natural gas plants. Set up the market that I'm talking about. It's the complete answer. You don't have to subsidize anybody. It'll be over. It'll be over in a week, and your consumer electric costs will go down probably by half. Mm-hmm. So there's my little rant on that subject. But I have. This doesn't take a genius to figure out. I figured it out looking at it for about 10 minutes. I've written about it for years, and there you go. Nobody's paying any attention to me. That's the way they are.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was trying to think of the right analogy, and given that I'm only on a 1 minute spot market, I may not come up with the right one right just yet. But call me in a month; I'll have a better one. But I think if I go to a hotel, I expect I don't know, to be able to turn the light switch on or to the shower and get hot water or light, whatever. At the moment, I don't expect it to be only on a good day. And the hotel is selling my comfort. I mean, that's what they're selling. They're not selling me to be comfortable only on, they'll say it's a hotel without a roof. It's like, this is a wonderful hotel. You're going to be absolutely great here unless it rains. That's not a hotel anymore. That's exactly. Camping, or even not even quite camping. That's whatever. So, you can't just have the smiley face times. You have to kind of take it as a responsibility. And so if you're doing a service or you're running a day camp, a hotel or whatever, you can't say, well, this is an awesome day camp and we're going to have swimming, I don't know, only when, whatever, only on Tuesdays when this happens. There has to be a reasonable service. It can't be awesome sometimes and absent the other. So I think you're on the right track. I don't think it would necessarily be completely onerous for those companies to have their own backup. The hotel has a backup system. They're probably working off the grid, but most hotels will have, some kind of backup generator, whatever. And things go out for a little bit, then they can back it up. And that's part of being the hotel, or that totality of service. And so if they want to be in the energy business as opposed to just solar, then they have to have that they have to own the answer. And then maybe they invest a little bit more kind of holistically, which I hate the word, but cooperatively, so that they can help those who frankly let them be in existence. They can't be in existence right now without the oil and gas industry providing the base that
Yeah.
lets them be kind of the dilettante.
There may be somebody who can figure out how to provide firm power cost effectively using some amount or a large amount of wind and solar, maybe batteries, maybe pump storage. I don't really care how they do it. The critical point is the only power that is useful to the consumer is firm power. It's power that's always there when you need it. Power that comes and goes with the weather is not useful. It's basically worthless. And the idea that we give it priority is completely brain dead. But that's what we do right now. And, I understand that New York is going to do that, probably Massachusetts and California. Texas, there's no excuse for it. These people, must be somebody in Texas who isn't this dumb, but I don't know.
Well, it's not it's not just dumb, it's kind of beholden.
I don't know. Are the Texas legislators beholden to the wind and solar industries? They might be. I don't know.
Well, there's probably a trickle down of subsidies coming from the federal level that gives companies credits, and then they get saddled with it. It sounds to me
But
like
why
they're
does
trying
Texas
to
get saddled? Like Texas has its own grid, so it's separate from the rest of the country.
But
so why can't Texas say this grid is only buying firm power? Your solar, the subsidy goes to the solar producer, the wind producer.
Mm-hmm.
Give them as much subsidy as they want, and maybe they can bid for be the federal government's business, and maybe they can bid a lower price for firm power as a result of bringing down their cost of wind and solar. But maybe they can't, because wind and solar are fundamentally so useless that that they may well not be able to make it.
I think we should get rid of cruise ships and just go back to sailboats. I mean, you don't see that too much. We could get rid of.
Well, but Randy, the sailboat analogy is actually a very good one here, because it's a very good analogy to the electricity market, because you could say sailing ships to transport people or freight across, more importantly, freight across the ocean. If you fuel them, if you will, with wind, that's free, and you save all that money on fuel, and therefore you're saving a lot of money. Well, it turns out that the fossil fuel fired ships put the sailing ships out of business. And why is that? Their cost of fuel is clearly higher, but they can get there on time reliably. That's the difference. And the fossil fuel powered ships, the gasoline or diesel powered ships, put the wind powered ships out of business. If you read about like the colonial times in America, going back and forth to England, and a lot of people went back and forth to England quite a lot, but it wasn't cheap. But the key thing is, it could take you 2 weeks or it could take you 2 months, and you didn't know when you left how long it was going to take. You could be becalmed out there, you could be blown off course. I'm sure today, with the technology we have, we could make substantial improvements over what they were able to accomplish, but there was no reliability in that trip. It could take weeks different. Now, once they had diesel powered cruise ships like the Titanic, that was what, a 2-day trip or something. That became a 2-day trip. But when in the day of wind power, it could be a 2-week trip if you were lucky, or a 2-month trip if you weren't lucky.
No, it's incredible. Not only that, you put yourself all to the vagaries of the wind. It can be too much. There's too much of a good thing sometimes. You're in a sailboat and, there's too much wind and you have to modulate, you have to turn things back. There's a lot more maintenance, whether you're having, I mean, the moving parts and so forth, they're difficult to get.
Well, the labor to work the sail. So then they came up with these very fast sailing ships, like the clipper ships. It took an enormous number of people to make those sails go. Now, could it all be automated today? Maybe it could. I don't know.
Yeah. So I can't tell you when, but this is probably 30 years ago. I think it was also in the Wall Street Journal. I read they were complaining that the U.S. used the bulk of fossil fuels. Given our population as a percentage of the world, people use more fossil fuels per person in the U.S. than they did in Pakistan or something like that. And what was left out was that the U.S. was the world's food basket. And the farmers in the U.S. produced, I'm not saying exactly, but 10 to 50 times more per person than the Pakistani farmers did. And they were talking about fuel, but the Pakistani farmers were using donkeys, and the U.S. had John Deere. So the one had a deer and the other had a donkey. And the donkey is on 24/7, so it's using energy all the time. And has to be fed. And it's far less efficient engine for tilling a field than the John Deere, which has an on and off switch. So you're using fossil fuel, but the total amount of energy applied is far less in the John Deere or the Caterpillar, to use another animal, than it is in the donkey. So you can have a Caterpillar, a deer, a donkey, and the donkey is the one that is the least efficient, even though it doesn't show up on the graph for how much fossil fuels get used. And so these kind of thing where people are measuring. I don't know. They're measuring things off completely different scales, and to push that analogy, they're putting their finger on that scale at the same time to get those things that feel politically squishy and cute and cuddly, rather than something that's actually going to warm them.
I think the productivity difference between the American and third world farmers has closed quite a lot in the last 30 years. And you're saying that you may have read that 30 years ago. I'm not saying it's completely closed. And I actually took a trip to Cambodia, I'd say 5 years ago now, 2018, and learned that close to half of Cambodian agriculture was, at least at that time still, I'm sure it hasn't changed all that much, powered by animals rather than tractors. But the change in productivity is in part mechanization, as you point out, and it's also in part fertilizer. And you probably, I'm sure you know, that fertilizer basically is a byproduct of natural gas today. It doesn't have to be; it could be made other ways, but mainly it is a byproduct of natural gas. Because the idea behind it's an amazing thing to me, and nobody seems to know this. There's now a war against nitrogen. Do you know about the war against nitrogen? I mean, this is what's fueling the European farmer protest.
Yeah, it's people are having. I can't say the word on air, but they're having a cluster something in their own brains. It's a very sadistic, self-mutilatory, self-flagellatory cycle that people are going through. It's just, you're not happy. You've got your food met, you've got your other needs met. No, that's not good enough. We wanted to have all be.
Well, you need purpose in life. You need purpose in life,
so
and your purpose
I think it becomes
making other people starve.
Yeah, it's a religious aspect.
The cause of some religious purity.
Yeah, I know, but the funny thing is the purity's there. Like the Netherlands, I'm going to show everyone the Netherlands to scale. It's teensy weensy, and it feeds like it's I think the second or third largest food producer in the world, maybe, or
it's not producer, it's exporter. It's the second largest food exporter in the world. So they produce a lot more than they consume, which is not saying that they're the largest food producer, but they're the largest food exporter.
Nonetheless, but it's clearly on the side of efficiency and production, rather than say, I don't know, I don't want to impugn any stand, but Tajikistan or Kazakhstan, which is probably more.
Well, but recognize, when 30 years ago, when you were talking about, or when you and I were younger, many of these third world countries had a huge problem of what they called feeding themselves. They didn't have enough food. They either had people starving from time to time, or they had or they had to import large amounts of food, even though the country was poor, and the amounts of money they had available to spend on this were not large, but they had to import food in order not to face starvation. Today, you almost don't hear about that issue anymore. And the two biggest changes that drive that, the funny thing is mechanization drives it some, but not that much. The ones that really drive it are fertilizer, and the other thing is green seeds. What are they called? But anyway, GMO seed, the modified seeds that are much more productive, right?
Yeah, genetically modified organisms.
Right, but suddenly the world can feed everybody without real strain, and nobody talks about that anymore. And so the young people don't even realize that as recently as when we were in our 20s, this was the world's #1 issue. Today it's gone away. The young people have never heard of it, and they can conduct a war against nitrogen, a war against fertilizer, a war against GMO crops, not realizing that this is the difference between millions of people starving and not. They have no idea.
Right. So you were in Washington recently.
Yes.
And I was looking at your blog. Can you tell us a little bit what that was, why you were there, what was accomplished? What's the argument, the fight?
What was accomplished? Well, my co-counsel and I got onto horses. We put on our armor. We got long lances. We had our colors, and on the other side there was a large windmill turning, and we ran at it with our lances, thinking we could knock it apart. Unfortunately, we end up falling on our asses. So, but that's a metaphor for what occurred. So
speaking of donkeys, that's Don Quixote.
Oh, Don Quixote, right? We were tilting at windmills, but maybe not, because if we were just tilting at windmills, we wouldn't be doing this. But we have put together a group of consumers who are interested in seeing what can be done in the court system to force the government to confront the lack of support, lack of scientific support for the entire war against fossil fuels and greenhouse gases. And the lack of scientific support for it is shocking, really, considering how this idea has swept the world among all the people who only read statements being repeated endlessly about what a crisis it is without ever looking at why it's supposed to be a crisis. So our government, our EPA, the Environmental Protection Administration in Washington during the Obama administration, beginning of it, adopted something called the endangerment finding, which finds the emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to be a danger to human health and welfare. Why is it a danger to human welfare, human health and welfare? Because temperatures might go up by a degree or two 100 years from now, supposedly. And they don't even have any basis for predicting that. Temperature here went up 10 degrees between when I got up this morning and now. You can barely notice it, but a degree or two over the next 100 years has been declared a danger by our EPA. So we put together this group to demand that the EPA go back and reconsider that. We actually, and by the way, that regulation called the endangerment finding of greenhouse gases is what underlies all of the government's war against fossil fuels, and all the efforts to block drilling, all the efforts to block pipelines, all the efforts to require less methane emission, methane being the same thing as natural gas, all the efforts to cut back on nitrogen emissions, all the electric car mandates, you name it. There are 100 different regulatory initiatives throughout the US government, all of them based on this so-called endangerment finding that was adopted in the Obama administration. So on the first day of the Trump administration, on Inauguration Day, of January 20, 2021, we put together this group and we filed a petition with the EPA saying, please reconsider and rescind this very stupid, destructive regulation. And we kind of had the idea that Trump was going to do that. Like he would say, oh, yes, thank you for your petition. EPA, please reconsider the endangerment finding. In fact, that never occurred during the Trump administration. They never reconsidered. And we kept sending in more petitions and more petitions, supplemental petitions. I think we sent in 7 of them during the Trump administration, and the last one went in after Biden had taken office. And finally, the EPA denied our petitions in 2022, last year, the early 2022, the second year of the Biden administration. And at that point, we said, okay, we're taking you to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals to see if they will compel you to reconsider it. Notice, not compel them to rescind it. No.
Right.
The court can't even do that. Just compel them to reconsider it in light of the evidence, the new evidence that we have presented, all of which has arisen since 2009 when the endangerment finding came down. So that all got briefed over the course of many months, and it was finally argued in the DC Circuit last Friday. Now, what happened in the DC Circuit? It's all off on a tangent because the only issue that the members of the court cared about is what's called standing. And I don't know how many of your listeners, watchers, viewers even know what that issue means. I'm happy to provide some background and education on it, but I guess my general comment is the law of standing is in such a position, such a ridiculous and irrational position as to make it so that any environmentalist can challenge any rule or regulation on the most slightest of grounds, like it's going to impair my view, or there will be 1 additional part per billion of some gas in the atmosphere is plenty to give standing to environmentalists. But we're saying, wait a minute, this conversion to wind and solar and renewable energy is driving up everybody's electric bill by a factor of 2 and 3 and 5 and costing consumers billions upon billions, if not trillions of dollars. Oh, your standing is very dubious, Mr. Concerned Household Electricity Consumers Council. And we are very, very concerned about that and have to think about it very, very carefully. So, and if they can get rid of our case on the ground of standing, then that means they won't compel the EPA to reconsider this.
Did you tell them that you actually are a carbon-based life form?
Or a what, carbon-based life form?
Yeah. Does that give you standing?
Well, no,
I was joking. You know, the fact of the matter is,
maybe I should educate you a little more, because you're a doctor rather than a lawyer. This is not the complicated part of the law, and
I know what it means. I'm familiar with standing. Whether you have been injured, you know, you're the injured party, and whether you collectively, I mean, this is like the concept behind class action, that, you know, somebody's injured and then you can extend the class of those injured to other people, and that needs a certain finding in order to do that. You know, I mean, if some guy hits a kid in my neighborhood, presumably the kid and the parents are have standing to sue the guy. I might, you know, say, oh, you know, the people drive too fast on the street in general. We should get rid of Domino's pizza delivery people because that's who did it. I may or may not have standing to do that. And the question would be, you know, can I extend the damage that happened in that one particular incident to something that affects me? You know,
yes. So you have to claim some harm to yourself.
Right.
And
I'm aware of that. I'm just saying, at the basis of it, though, I mean, isn't carbon dioxide itself one of the things they're claiming is a danger?
Yes.
Right. So it's, I mean, you know, wouldn't that kind of ipso facto, like, say, well, Judge, shouldn't you get off the bench since you're breathing? You know, shouldn't the EPA close down because they're, you know, in order to heat or either heat or cool the place, they're using, you know, energy making carbon dioxide? I mean, shouldn't we stop all functioning until you've like figured out that carbon dioxide per se cannot be a lethal gas. I mean, carbon dioxide, my plants and the trees, whatever, they would not live without carbon dioxide. That is what makes them. It's kind of like, I don't want to sound too much like the Lion King, but it's the cycle of life, or the circle of life. The carbon cycle. To get things from trees, and they absorb the energy from the sun. Blah blah blah. They create stored energy. We eat it. We create kinetic energy. We breathe out the carbon dioxide, so forth. But it's kind of like an absurdity to have isolated carbon dioxide as the tool and mean. I mean, would you have standard?
How that ever happened? How carbon dioxide became the devil gas, and the movement to restrict and eliminate the emissions of it became a religious movement that has swept through all the politicians and all the governments of the West, and this gigantic campaign to spend trillions upon trillions of dollars to limit carbon emissions. This is the greatest craziness in the history of the world. I can't explain it. I can't offer any way that this came about, but here we are.
Well, it's not there's going to be more. There's more to come. Just you wait. There's going to be silliness on top of silliness. I'm going to have as a guest let's see, 10 days, Heather MacDonald from the Manhattan Institute. So they share a name, Manhattan, with the Manhattan Contrarian. But her book, When Race Trumps Merit, I'm reading right now, and so I'm kind of a little bit at the beginning, cherry picking the chapters. And the one on medicine, I'm reading quite a bit, and I don't want to give this one away, but they're getting rid of the concept of teaching medicine in medical school, and the concept of having to be able to, I don't know, resuscitate somebody, or they're making third-year clerkships into advocacy, and they're getting rid of grades. Anyway, they're making the whole apparatus, for the sake of piety.
You got to die before your doctor retires.
Well, it's a funny thing. I was with a younger guy. Actually, I was at the announcement speech of RFK Jr. He chose the Boston Park Plaza because Boston, Kennedy, et cetera, et cetera. He lives, I believe, in California. But he was there, and a lot of the COVID resistance, pillars were there. So I saw Jeffrey Tucker, Dr. Robert Malone, Steve Kirsch, Pierre Corey was there. A lot of guys that I know and admire and spoken with and have had on the show and so forth. But what is my point here? Gosh, I guess I've lost my point. I apologize. But piety. A lot of these things, pronouncements are piety. So I mean, his speech compared to Biden, it was very, very workable. But he has cut his teeth on being an environmental lawyer before he became a freedom. Don't give everyone the vaccine willy-nilly kind of guy. And so there were aspects where he's into freedom, but a lot of it, I'm going to come to the point here. On the one part, he's thinking back to the good old days when the Kennedys were in charge and so forth, JFK and RFK, and those days. And when the U.S. was the supreme power, we were the biggest, superpower, the biggest producer of this and this and this. And then on the other hand, he, spent his time in the Hudson Valley as an anti-environmentalist, I think getting the nuclear, the Indian Point plant off the grid, and bringing, making fish happy in the Hudson River and so forth. But it's somewhat inimical. You can't be the powerhouse, food producer and all this kind of stuff, and also, have outsourced all of your industry and outsource all, and then have these unreliable power grids. You can't do both. You can't be this, anyway. You can't kind of. You can have your cake and eat it, but you can't eat your cake and have it.
Well, yes, Robert F. Kennedy. I mean, he's gaining a new respect with me, but he's got a long way to go because, as you point out, he has been an activist on opposing COVID vaccines, or at least opposing them for everybody, or certainly opposing the mandate of them. And I certainly support him on that. But long before that, he was an activist in opposing all the other vaccines, which actually have a much better case for them, for better or worse. And and he's also been an environmentalist activist in the power sector. I haven't specifically seen where he comes out on global warming and CO2, but I would have no doubt that he is a anti-carbon dioxide advocate, which I think is pretty dumb. So, you know, even a stopped clock is right twice a day, as they say. He got one right. And I appreciate it and I applaud him, but let's get to work on the other issues.
No, I agree. So it was an interesting time. There were a lot of things that were redolent, you know, not quite of a Trump rally. I mean, he touched on very similar points, but it was much more polarizing. He reminisced about the funereal train from California to Washington when he was 14 and his dad had been assassinated. And he thought back, you know, looking out of the train, it took many more hours than would have been anticipated because there were people on the tracks, you know, mourning and so forth. But he kept saying there were white people at the train stop, you know, holding up, and other places there were black people, and then other places there were brown people. I mean, I just don't think as a 14-year-old he was thinking and looking at it through that lens of, you know, micromanaging their ethnicities and so forth. I mean, I grew up. I don't want to shock my viewers, but I grew up white. And in my neighborhood, that wasn't enough. I mean, you know, I could have said, "Oh, I'm white," you know, leave me alone. But frankly, you know, the Italian kids fought the Irish kids fought the Jewish kids, you know, everyone was fighting whatever. And it's like, oh, if only I had known that it was enough to say, "Hey, dude, we're all white here." I mean, this concept that, you know, humans have been, you know, so his intro speaker was this guy, Jamel Holly, who's a bit of a defrocked council person in New Jersey or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a good speaker, but apparently he got his hand caught in the cookie jar of actually like altering votes. So that's, I guess that's a no-no. I don't know.
Doesn't sound good.
Yeah, it's not that great. And anyway, there's this whole vein of polarization of figuring out, you know, I'm going to leave that alone. I mean, there were a lot of good things. I guess what I was going to say is that he had a lot of themes that were, you know, positive and getting people together and all that kind of stuff and getting back for freedom. But at the same time, everything had to kind of be labeled in a black-white way, because that seems to be the currency of speak within the Democrat Party. And you know, it's in the movies. There's I probably won't go down this vein, but you know, you'll notice that for this speech, like the lead singer, black, the incantation, black guy, the main intro speaker, black person, and behind, you know, they have that kind of staged audience. You know, they very carefully pick the facial demographics, and this is, I guess, the point I was trying to make is there's this culture of piety, which I think that, you know, we're all children of God, and we have the ability to love each other and do the right thing and so forth. But, you know, there's this inherent division where we're going to take things away based on, you know, this new scale that we've invented. And in this case, you know, the fact that you know, can, I don't know, do a wash, you know, or drive your car or whatever, that's not good enough, you know, because whatever the environmental equivalent of, you know, racism is, you know, fossil fuelism. And the other aspect I guess I was going to bring up is this word denier. I guess where I started with this was that, you know, Kennedy seen as a vax denier. I'm not a vax denier. I've given out tens of thousands of vaccines. I've taken dozens of them myself, but there's a time and a place for all these things. And people, I think, have to get back to rationality, because the truth, you know, and necessity does have a vote at the table.
Well, unfortunately, the real world, it turns out to be much more complicated. It's more complicated than most people can really keep track of, right? I mean, you want to limit the number of things you have to pay attention to every day by taking what could be major issues and putting them in a simple category. Vaccine good, vaccine bad. Either I'm going to take it or all vaccines are good or bad. Oh, what? Some of them are good sometimes, some of them are bad other times. Some should be taken by kids, some should be taken by old people. This becomes way too complicated for people to figure out. They want to know vaccine good or vaccine bad. I mean, that's why we have doctors. But unfortunately, when something becomes a political issue, the political process just can't deal with details. It just can't deal with details, and that's a a huge problem in this energy transition
Yeah.
thing as well. People want to say, oh, carbon dioxide bad. Well, unfortunately, there's a huge amount of detail. You can't just eliminate carbon dioxide so easily, and maybe it's not so bad at all.
Well, I mean, I think they also miss out that when CO2 level goes up, plants grow faster. Um, this is just very simple stuff. Plants have to work less to obtain their CO2, and they grow faster. I mean, it's kind of a standard greenhouse. I mean, the greenhouse effect is named after a greenhouse. Anyway,
Yeah, you probably know that greenhouses pump in CO2 to enhance the CO2 content of the atmosphere to make the plants grow faster.
yeah. Well, I mean, that would sort of make sense. Like, your kids are going to grow fast if you feed them. I mean, I tried to avoid feeding them because I didn't want them to get bigger than me, but that didn't seem to
Didn't
work.
work.
No, it didn't work. And they were insistent, they would cry and stuff like that.
They would start crying.
Yeah, I know. So, but it's a nice thing. I mean, you wind up feeding them, and then, they can make conversation, and they give you a lot of joy and laughs as time goes on. I think people are forgetting that part. Everyone's kind of in the same religion race together of calling other people deniers and other people this and that, and they're forgetting all the kind of good and the gratitude and all that. Anyway, I don't want to get too.
Well, Randy, I think you were saying before, people have become rich. They don't have to work as hard as they used to. And I think really hard work, I mean, read how hard our ancestors worked. It's unbelievable. Really hard work just takes your mind off all your problems. I mean, all these anxieties and worries and angers that we have today, they didn't have. They were too busy working. Now we don't have enough to do. And what do? We get all angry at each other. I guess I get angry once in a while, not very much. I don't think I'm a very angry person, but boy, there are a lot of angry people in the world.
Yeah, no, it's true. So I had a little plumbing issue. We have a lawn here, and apparently I can get a separate water meter and have just water going out without paying the sewage coming in. They bless it, anoint it, the inspector comes out. So I put a new meter in.
So this is water that just runs off. It does not go back into the sewer system. So
yeah.
you are putting less burden on the sewer system, so you don't have to pay the sewer piece. Fabulous.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to drop that. I'm going to leave that one there. But there basically is a cost continuum. In order to make that decision, I have to make a cost decision about it. The guy came in. He told me a price. We'll call it X $1,000. And then when he was done, it was 2X. He sent me an invoice. I'm like, I don't think you can do it. I says, well, I had to put in this, this bell and this whistle and this and da 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 da. I'm like, yeah, but you gave me an estimate. He's like, yeah, but I said, anyway, push comes to shove. I said you had to give me a decision point where you decide, you have to stop and say, it's going to cost you 2X. Do you want me to do this? Because I wouldn't make that same decision if the facts on the ground had changed. If you told me 2X, I would not have done it because I'm only going to be saving a certain amount over time.
So now what? It's going to take you. You'll be dead before you save enough money.
Right. So we wound up coming to an amicable conclusion. But the point here is that there's kind of a matrix out there of decision making, and you have to understand the near term costs of buying this new meter versus the long term savings of doing X, Y, and Z. What we're doing now is we're kind of putting the money in, and we're spending a lot, but we're not getting savings. We're getting exactly the opposite. We're spending more to get things that cost more. And where does that all end? People think they're immune.
What field or arena are you talking about? Are you talking about the energy industry now?
Yeah, the energy. I mean, I'm just using my thing as an analogy of putting out outlay. Right, you're spending money.
We're putting out trillions of dollars on the electric system, and when all is said and done, the best we can hope for is the exact same electricity
that we had before, but paying, and you're going to be spending
trillions of dollars expended.
You're going to be spending more for it. So all of these things.
Of course, you're going to pay more for it, and then they'll say to you, "Well, but you emitted less carbon dioxide." Will the world actually know that?
Yeah,
barely perceptible.
It's a funny thing. I don't think society has ever done this, where they've taken away their own means of food and their own means of getting around and this and that because they feel badly about themselves. I mean, it's just a funny thing. It's a funny time.
Well, you say society. I mean, there certainly are religious sects and cults or monasteries, monks, groups, what do they call them? Orders of monks who restrict their diet or don't talk, right? They take a vow of silence or vows of poverty, right? And they will only live and spend all day reading the Bible or the Torah or the Quran. There definitely are sects like that. There are people like the Shakers, right?
But those are at least quasi-voluntary, quasi.
I'm more than quasi. They're entirely voluntary.
The Shakers, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose you can't be born into a Shaker group, right? So they've taken that out of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, think about the original, and you lived there in Boston area. The original settlers there were very strict Puritans who enforced very strict rules of behavior and morality on their communities. I guess it didn't last all that long, but it lasted a while. It lasted more than a little while. But again, I guess it was voluntary. At least it was voluntary in the sense of the people who originally went over to Massachusetts. Then the next round is children, next generation. And I think over the course of generations that dissipated, but it certainly started out being the whole community that was bought into that.
All right, so we're rounding out the hour. I know you have other things to do.
I know, I'm a very busy man. I have my homeowners association annual meeting tonight.
All right, so do you have any thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Fight the good fight. That's all I can say. You know what? I was talking about the human beings need some purpose in life. And so I retired from a real job, a difficult job. I guess that gave me some purpose, or at least it kept me so busy that I couldn't think about my anxieties and why the world was going to hell. But then when I retired from that, I needed some purpose. So I started a blog and I tried to disseminate interesting thoughts and
you do actually
doing stupid things. So I do my best.
No,
a few people listen now and then. So I hope your readership will.
It's been, it's like attracting flies with honey. You put it out there and then you got me. I
have some excellent readers. I really have some excellent.
Yeah, and you have excellent readers, and you have me. So
and I have you.
Yeah. So I like to end with a shameless self-promotion. I apologize. This is my book. This is how you can help support the work here. If you enjoyed our conversation, go buy this book. You don't have to read it. You do have to buy it. And it's got my name on it. It's got my portrait. This is me in the morning. Actually, I don't drink coffee. Maybe I should start. So it's called Overturning Zika, and it has to do with the last great pandemic. And I find this amazing, fascinating story. I had no idea I was going to write this book, I swear. 2019, I noticed it had disappeared. And I thought it was a weird thing to begin with. The name and everything like that. I read it at the time. Zika was another dengue, basically. And dengue never caused microcephaly, millions and millions of cases. And Zika somehow did. Anyway, and I just wrote a short article. I couldn't get it published anywhere. It was kind of a weird political thing, I think. And there's a whole story there. You can, if you read the blurb here, you'll read what a weird encounter I had at the Journal of the American Medical Association. And I've had another one with the New York Times, erstwhile science reporter Donald McNeil. Anyway,
I know that guy.
Do you?
He got kicked out.
He what?
McNeil, isn't he the guy that got kicked out?
Yeah, and so too did the two editors I spoke with on a Zoom call in early 2020, Doctors Livingston, I presume, and Dr. Bauschner. They both wound up on the altar of woke culture. I mean, we make fun of the Aztecs for like slaughtering, hundreds of virgins, so forth. We wind up taking our kind of best and brightest. These are a very accredited guy. I don't agree with any of them necessarily across the board, but I give them props. They're smart people. They went to top schools. They went through massive education, and then have to apologize for nothing. And when they do, they still will lose their jobs. It's like an amazing process. We're in this kind of penitent, sacrificial mode. I hope things work out. Anyway, so that's my importuning to all of you out there. Buy this book. I think you're going to like it. Leave a review. If you didn't like the book, leave a positive review. If you like the book, leave a positive review. No, but I think it's an interesting topic, and it's timely because Zika has not been monetized yet for a vaccine. There's a vaccine around the corner. It's been 8 years. Donald McNeil, by the way, told his interest was telling women throughout Latin America, potentially through the tropics around the world, to stop having children entirely until a Zika vaccine came onto the scene. Now it's let me check my watch. It's 8 years later, and there's been no Zika vaccine. So we would have what's the opposite of surfeit? A complete absence of children throughout Latin America if we listen to Donald McNeil. But kudos to him. He got a book out of it, and it sold more copies than mine. Anyway, any last words?
No, that's it. I'm done.
All right, perfect. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Randy.